I'm going to quote one other thing from the recent Atlantic piece you wrote. It starts with another quote from Roosevelt Montes. Every year, Montes says, I witness Socrates bringing students, my high school students as well as my Columbia students, to serious contemplation of the ultimately existential issues his philosophy demands we grapple with. Montes writes, my students from low-income households do not take this sort of thinking to be the exclusive privilege of a social elite. In fact, they find in it a vision of dignity and excellence that is not constrained by material limitations. And then you add to this, you say, this position may have once seemed obvious. And you say, think of how W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and Frederick Douglass stressed the importance of a universal humanistic education. But, you add, today, that thing that seemed obvious then is, quote, radical and contested.
Right, because, I mean, this is even very different than when I was growing up, but I think it has to do with the fact that those students are being introduced to those texts with someone like Roosevelt, who they relate to and who's bringing them to the text in a way that they trust. And it feels like how my father is bringing some of my friends and I to it. Some of my friends also had their lives changed by coming to my house and reading with my father, but I don't know that they would have necessarily approached those texts the same way had it just been dropped on them in school. It was it's also the person kind of showing you that these things matter, and you can see how it works with you. Now we have, in the piece, what I was referring to is now we have this kind of reevaluation of these ancient figures and the Western tradition itself as being inherently what is in today's parlance called white supremacist, or as being emblems of whiteness, and that are necessarily exclusive. And so you have a kind of, it's radical to say what he's saying, no, Socrates belongs to these underprivileged, materially underprivileged Dominican kids in the Bronx, just as much as, or maybe more, because he's telling them how to survive existentially, what types of questions to ask to live a meaningful life and to flourish. He's talking about exactly what has to do with their lives. But there's an argument now that says, no, like they need to actually read and think about people who physically resemble them. And Socrates was a white man. And, I reject that out of hat because it's absurd to say, because whiteness is a relatively recent concept. And Socrates, we know that the Athenians didn't look around and say, we're all a bunch of white people here, it's all good. They said, no, I'm an Athenian, and like if you're in the next city-state, you're a barbarian.
That was a problem. Yeah. Yeah, if you're from Sparta, then there's a real problem.
They didn't say we've all got similar, epidermises. That wasn't how they thought of themselves. So it's a kind of revision of, it's looking at the past through the prism of the present in a very specific way of thinking about identity.
One of the many pitfalls in that what you've just outlined is, of course, if you weren't to have, say, Socrates as a figure on which to base that, you would have to have a Socrates-like figure. And there aren't many around.
No, he was a pretty unique individual. You're saying, but I'm not following your question. You're saying that if you wanted to say that he defines whiteness?
If you wanted to, that if you wanted to say we can't deal with Socrates,
who else are you? Right.
Then you've got to have a Socrates-like figure to fill the gap.
Right.
And there's not many around.
Well, this is actually something I really agreed with Ta-Nehisi Coates on when he said, Saul Bellow asked, who's the Tolstoy of the Zulus? And Ta-Nehisi Coates says, I reject that question. Tolstoy's the Tolstoy of the Zulus. Sure. And Socrates is the Socrates of the Dominican kids in the Bronx. You don't have to find somebody that comes from the Dominican Republic who was Socrates.
The people who would suggest that Socrates doesn't belong to everybody don't very often suggest who ought to be put in that place.
That's right. Or they, I find, suggest far more contemporary thinkers that even if you read as generously as possible, simply haven't stood the test of time to substantiate that they are equivalent voice to swap with someone like Socrates. And what really intrigues me about this line of thinking is that It's that horseshoe where the anti-racists actually end up really agreeing with the same premises that the real racists have, which is that they also think that Socrates and the classics and the Western tradition belongs to white people. And they're very happy for you to say, yeah, you're right. Socrates isn't yours.
Yeah.
He's ours.
Yeah.
And I really hesitate to ever find myself in a position where I'm mimicking the same exact patterns of thought that that racists who believe that the thing that matters is the racial category and that's what can't be transcended.